Albert Camus, 1913–1960, was a French philosopher, writer, and journalist, often associated with existentialism and absurdism. One of his most famous philosophical essays is The Myth of Sisyphus, published in 1942, in which he explores the absurdity of human existence and the search for meaning in a meaningless world. Camus offers the myth of Sisyphus, a figure from ancient Greek mythology, as a metaphor for human life, where the struggle itself becomes the purpose of life. The context of the myth of Sisyphus. Camus wrote The Myth of Sisyphus during World War II, a time of intense existential crisis for Europe. The horrors of the war, the rise of totalitarianism, and the sense of meaninglessness in modern life influenced many intellectuals of the time, including Camus. He, however, rejected the label of existentialist, even though his ideas have often been linked to existentialist thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre. In this essay, Camus confronts the central question of whether life is worth living in a world devoid of meaning. He introduces the concept of the absurd, which arises from the clash between human beings' desire for significance and the universe's indifference. The myth of Sisyphus is Camus' attempt to reconcile the tension between these two forces. The absurd. The absurd is a core concept in Camus' philosophy. It refers to the dissonance between the human tendency to search for meaning and the universe's inability to provide any clear answers. According to Camus, life is fundamentally meaningless. Human beings naturally seek explanations, patterns, and purposes, but the world offers no satisfying answers. This conflict creates the experience of the absurd, a kind of existential contradiction. Camus suggests that people face three possible responses to the absurd. The first is to turn to religion or metaphysical belief systems, which attempt to provide a comforting explanation of the world's mysteries. However, Camus rejects this approach, calling it philosophical suicide, as it avoids confronting the reality of the absurd by imposing artificial meaning on life. The second response is literal suicide, which Camus also rejects. Though it might seem like a logical solution to the absurd, Camus argues that suicide is an evasion of the problem rather than a solution. Suicide is a renunciation of life and, by extension, of the potential for meaning through living. Instead of fleeing the absurd, Camus advocates for embracing it and finding ways to live in spite of it. The third response, and the one Camus supports, is to live with the absurd without appealing to false hopes or escape mechanisms. This involves acknowledging the lack of inherent meaning in life and continuing to live fully and authentically despite it. This is the essence of Camus' philosophy of revolt, a constant, conscious confrontation with the absurd. The myth of Sisyphus. The central metaphor of Camus' essay is the myth of Sisyphus, a figure from Greek mythology. According to the myth, Sisyphus was condemned by the gods to an eternity of rolling a boulder up a hill, only for it to roll back down each time he reached the summit. This punishment was meant to be a symbol of futility and hopelessness. Camus sees Sisyphus as the perfect embodiment of the human condition. His endless labor represents the human struggle for meaning in a world that offers none. However, rather than viewing Sisyphus' situation as tragic, Camus argues that Sisyphus is an absurd hero. In his constant, unrelenting effort, Sisyphus finds a kind of freedom. He is aware of the futility of his task but continues to push the boulder regardless. Camus famously concludes that one must imagine Sisyphus happy. In this sense, Sisyphus' happiness lies in his awareness and acceptance of the absurdity of his condition. He does not hope for the boulder to stay at the top of the hill, nor does he resign himself to despair. Instead, he finds meaning in the struggle itself. For Camus, this reflects the human condition. We are condemned to search for meaning in a world that does not provide it, but through our awareness and continuous efforts, we can carve out our own form of happiness. The absurd hero. Sisyphus is the model for what Camus calls the absurd hero. This figure is someone who, recognizing the absurdity of existence, does not flee from it but rather embraces it with full consciousness. The absurd hero does not seek consolation in religion, philosophy, or hope for an afterlife. Instead, they fully accept the futility of life and, paradoxically, find freedom in this acceptance. Camus suggests that by acknowledging the absurd and living in defiance of it, humans can achieve a kind of victory. The victory comes not from the attainment of some grand, external meaning but from the personal meaning created by living authentically within the bounds of the absurd. The absurd hero creates value through action and effort, even knowing that these efforts will not lead to any ultimate resolution or purpose. This leads to Camus' larger philosophical position that life is worth living, not because it has intrinsic meaning but because we can give it meaning through our actions, choices, and the act of rebellion against absurdity itself. In this way, Camus' philosophy is one of affirmation, not resignation. Even in a meaningless universe, life can be lived fully. Revolt, freedom, and passion. Camus outlines three key concepts in response to the absurd: revolt, freedom, and passion. Revolt, as mentioned earlier, is the decision to live in constant awareness of the absurd without succumbing to the temptation of suicide or false hope. It is the refusal to accept the meaningless universe on its own terms while also rejecting any artificial meaning imposed by religion or metaphysics. For Camus, revolt is the most fundamental human act in the face of absurdity. Freedom, in Camus' philosophy, comes from the recognition of the absurd. Once individuals realize that life has no inherent meaning, they are free to live without the constraints of traditional morality or metaphysical systems. This freedom is not the kind of freedom promised by political ideologies or religious doctrines. It is a personal freedom that arises from the knowledge that, in a universe without purpose, we are free to create our own values and live according to them. Passion is the third element in Camus' response to the absurd. Passion means living life to its fullest, experiencing it intensely and authentically. For Camus, life is not to be endured or suffered through but embraced with vigor and enthusiasm. The absurd hero lives passionately, not because they believe in some higher purpose but because they find joy and fulfillment in the act of living itself. The role of art and creation. Camus also discusses the role of art and creativity in responding to the absurd. In the absence of any transcendent meaning, art becomes a way for humans to express their revolt against the absurd and create their own sense of meaning. Art, for Camus, is an act of rebellion against the silent and indifferent universe. Through artistic creation, the absurd hero asserts their freedom and individuality. Art allows for the expression of the complexities and contradictions of the human condition, acknowledging both the absurdity of life and the beauty that can be found within it. Camus believed that, like Sisyphus, the artist is engaged in a process of creation that may ultimately be futile but is still meaningful in its own right. The artist, much like the absurd hero, does not seek to impose meaning on the world but instead reflects the world's absurdity while still celebrating the act of creation. In this sense, art becomes a powerful form of revolt against the absurd, offering a way to live authentically in a world without inherent purpose. The impact of Camus' philosophy. The myth of Sisyphus had a significant impact on existentialist and absurdist philosophy. Although Camus rejected the label of existentialism, his work shares many themes with existentialist thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, particularly in its focus on human freedom, the absurd, and the rejection of traditional metaphysical systems. Camus' philosophy of the absurd influenced a wide range of intellectuals, writers, and artists, especially in the post-World War II period, when existential questions about the nature of human existence became particularly pressing. His focus on the individual's confrontation with the absurd resonated with people living in the wake of the war's devastation and the collapse of traditional values and beliefs. However, Camus' work has also been criticized, particularly for his rejection of the possibility of transcendent meaning. Some critics argue that Camus' philosophy offers little more than a form of nihilism, where human life is ultimately meaningless, and the only response is a kind of stoic resignation to the absurd. Others have praised Camus for offering a more hopeful and life-affirming response to the absurd, one that celebrates human freedom and creativity in the face of meaninglessness. Albert Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus remains one of the most important works in existential and absurdist philosophy. Through his exploration of the myth of Sisyphus, Camus presents a powerful metaphor for the human condition, where the search for meaning in an indifferent universe becomes the central challenge of existence. Rather than offering escape from the absurd, Camus advocates for a life of revolt, freedom, and passion, where the struggle itself becomes the source of meaning. By embracing the absurd and continuing to live authentically and passionately, Camus believes that we can find a kind of fulfillment, even in the absence of any ultimate purpose. Like Sisyphus pushing his boulder up the hill, we must imagine ourselves happy in the act of living, even in a universe that offers no final answers.